Where We Live on Connecticut Public. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Connecticut has a long-standing housing crisis, and advocates point to local zoning as a barrier in the way of building more affordable, multifamily units in communities across our state. Coming up, we learned about how recent efforts in our state to desegregate communities through zoning reform are now informing efforts to create a national zoning atlas. Sarah Bronin, a professor at Cornell University, joins us. And we hear from Yale Law professor Robert Ellickson about his new book, America's Frozen Neighborhoods, The Abuse of Zoning. First, the town of Woodbridge, Connecticut, a suburb in New Haven County, has been sued over its zoning regulations. Civil rights attorneys and housing advocates allege Woodbridge zoning policies violate a state fair housing law by restricting the development of affordable multifamily apartments. Now, how the lawsuit is decided could have repercussions on zoning ordinances in Connecticut's 169 towns and beyond. For more, joining us first on Zoom is Camila Vallejo, Connecticut Public's housing reporter, also a core member with Report for America. Camila, welcome back to the show.
Hi, Lucy. Thank you so much for having me.
Our listeners can join as well, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Camila, you attended this press conference in August when the lawsuit I mentioned was first announced. Let's take a listen to Erin Boggs. She's director of the Open Communities Alliance and the principal of Open Communities Trust, one of the plaintiffs in the lawsuit.
To be clear, Woodbridge is not alone in engaging in exclusionary zoning. Towns across Connecticut and across the country zone to keep out certain groups. The deep levels of segregation in Connecticut today are foreseeable outcomes of decades of exclusionary zoning practices. By keeping so much of the state off limits for the development of denser housing that is less expensive to build, these practices have also generated an affordable housing crisis, felt all the more acutely as we contend with COVID-era market pressures and evictions.
So Camila, she said Woodbridge is not alone. So tell us more about this suit and why Woodbridge is named in this particular suit challenging its zoning practices.
Absolutely. A group of civil rights lawyers and housing advocates claim that Woodbridge's current zoning practices are exclusionary, that they don't allow for economic and racial diversity in the town because they don't allow for multifamily housing to be built in majority of the town, which tends to open the doors for affordable housing. And how we got here is that in 2020, Open Communities Trust submitted a petition to allow multifamily housing developments in all of Woodbridge, in all of its residential areas. And that led into several public hearings, expert testimonies, a lot of public comment. And in the end, the commission decided not to move with the proposal, but instead create their own zoning updates. But Open Communities Trust and the group of civil rights lawyers say that's not enough to fix the problem of exclusionary zoning and the laws the municipality is allegedly violating.
Tell us more about the laws, because we know that this is a conversation that's happened in the last 2 years, especially on what towns are able to enforce in terms of what is built in their communities and how much say the state has. There's, of course, a debate about that. So I'm wondering if you can tell us more about the laws that Woodbridge is potentially violating here.
Absolutely. So the lawsuit says that Woodbridge is violating three different things. Number one is the Zoning Enabling Act, which gives municipalities the authority to set zoning controls in their communities. And that could be the size of a development, how many buildings should be built on a lot, the lot size, and more. And the act says, among other things, that the municipality should use these requirements to promote health and safety, stop overcrowding, and of course, allow housing opportunity for low and moderate income households and respond to the region's need for multifamily housing. So the lawsuit says that Woodbridge is violating that by not making an effort to create more housing for low-income residents. It's also saying that it's violating the Connecticut Fair Housing Act, which says that there should be no discrimination when it comes to housing for several protected groups. And the plaintiffs say that zoning in Woodbridge disproportionately impacts Black and Latino households that tend to need more affordable housing, like the one multifamily developments can open the doors to. And then lastly, it says that it's violating due process, equal protection, and the anti-segregation portions of the Connecticut Constitution.
Now, we reached out to Woodbridge for comment and did not hear back for this morning's show. But how has the town responded, Camila?
So as far as I know, the town hasn't necessarily responded to the lawsuit.
You're hearing Camila Vallejo here where we live, Connecticut Public's housing reporter, as we learn more about a suit filed against the town of Woodbridge over its zoning laws and what type of development housing they permit within the town. Joining us now for more perspective is Sean Gio, who is policy director for the Partnership for Strong Communities. Sean, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Lucy. Good morning.
Camila did a great job talking about the different laws on the books when it relates to what types of housing should be permitted in particular communities. A lot of this circle, I think, centers around something called 830G, and I'm wondering if you can talk about this suit and how this particular state law plays a part.
Sure. I would say, so for those, the Section 830G is the statutory reference for the Connecticut's Affordable Housing Appeals Act, which was enacted back in 1990 by the legislature during an earlier housing crisis of affordability in the state. And it's related to this suit in as much as 830G applies to towns that do not have at least 10% of their housing is affordable. So it's related to the suit in Woodbridge only in the sense that Woodbridge does not have a lot of affordable housing, and it's resisted affordable housing growth over the years. Just using 830G as a reference, back in 1993, when the town had 4 affordable housing units. Now in 2021, nearly 30 years later, the town has grown to 41 units, so a net gain of 37.
When we hear about 830G recently, with this election year, we're hearing gubernatorial candidate Bob Stefanowski calling for its repeal. Some say that it's not working. I'm wondering if you can respond to that.
Sure. I think first, 830G came out of a Blue Ribbon Commission, bipartisan commission back in the late 80s, and there were 26 recommendations, I believe. One of those turned into what we now call 830G. A few of the other recommendations were passed, but by and large, they were not. So 830G, which is a developer's ability to appeal certain zoning decisions and have the burden of proof on the town. 830G was always conceived as one tool and not as it's often erroneously called a policy. It's in fact just an ability for the developer to have ability to appeal certain decisions. And I think it's become more controversial over the years, particularly this year, because as a reflection of the growing housing crisis, rents and home values have skyrocketed, which changes the financial equation for some developers, that becomes more attractive to build. So in places, say, for instance, in Lower Fairfield County, where they'd really like to expand housing, people want to move there. Developers find 830G, they can make those developments work financially. So we have seen more developments through 830G. But, the real, if you really think the 830G is an interesting thing in that it's an expression of the town's resistance. And if towns, and I mentioned the Woodbridge numbers, had proactively worked to expand affordable housing in their communities, then 830Gs would not be an option for developers.
When you mention expand affordable housing in a particular town, how much of their housing stock would need to be affordable per se, where they would then have, I guess more, they wouldn't have to follow this 830G law?
Sure. Communities that have 10% of their housing stock designated as affordable based on the statute's definition are exempt from the statute. There's also moratorium provisions that were added in 2000, where which essentially give temporary exemptions, 4-year exemption from the statute when a town achieves a certain amount of incremental growth. It's about 2% of their housing stock. But one thing I think we often there's different kinds of affordable housing, and the Act reflects that. It recognizes, it counts housing that gets government subsidy, so public housing, but also rental vouchers for folks count, and also single-family mortgages that are underwritten by the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority are also counted. And finally, deed-restricted homes, what folks which encompasses 830G developments along with others.
Now, Sean, this particular lawsuit focuses on Woodbridge, but depending on how it's decided, could have repercussions on how communities zone for particular housing. So looking statewide, how is the state doing in terms of the variety of housing that can serve the needs of the residents here?
Well, I think I looked back recently, and essentially affordable housing remains very concentrated in a few of our communities, as it was when the Act 830G, again, looking back at that, it was passed. About 77 or 78% of all of the affordable homes in Connecticut, through designated affordable homes in Connecticut, are in the 31 municipalities that are exempt from 830G. The towns have had 30 plus years now, since 1990, to work on this. And unfortunately, many of them have not seen much progress. I mentioned Woodbridge. Their change over that time period was about 1%, 1 percentage point. And that's the case for many, many communities in the state.
You can join our conversation, 888-720-9677, as we talk about the housing crisis in our state. I'm curious how your community is responding to the development of housing that serves all of its residents, and also thinking about ways to include more people who are looking to be in particular communities for all the reasons that we seek out communities for its safety, for the quality of schools, again, for the services that towns provide. Again, our number, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Sean, the Connecticut Mirror's Tom Condon recently reported that state housing data show an estimated 8,500 affordable housing units, mostly rental apartments, and then another 18,000 market rate units in set-aside developments have been created thanks to 830G. That's since 1990. And Condon profiled one such complex in Griswold Hills in Newington. And so when we think about the housing crisis that's persisting, what more can state lawmakers, municipal leaders do from the perspective of the Partnership for Strong Communities?
Sure. And I think the first thing folks can do is try to see outside or beyond 830G and really look to what the affordable housing crisis means for the residents of the state. And the state has invested over the last 10 years or so more than $1 billion in affordable housing development construction on its own, and many millions of dollars for vouchers. And what local leaders can do is really advocate to their legislators to increase those amounts. If we really want to expand the availability of affordable homes and expand access to communities through vouchers, we need pressure on and advocacy from local officials to expand those investments.
Camila Vallejo is still with us, Connecticut Public's housing reporter. I've mentioned affordable housing several times. Camila, could you break it down further for us when we talk about affordable housing, what that means and how much of a gap remains in our state?
Absolutely. So affordable housing really is, housing that, is for people who might make less than 80% of the area median income in their particular communities. And that really could be, anyone. I think when we talk about affordable housing, we always tend to say, it's housing for our, police officers, for our teachers, but it's also housing for our, grocery store workers, our, people that just keep our communities running. These different kind of careers have different incomes, and therefore affordable housing is, an ability to house people and based on the income that they earn. Recently the Department of Housing did, took a look into what the gap looks like. And it's, a gap of about 90,000 units for our low income earners.
90,000. Sean, I wonder if you could respond to that number.
Yeah, I think people hear that number and they think 90,000 homes, but I think I mentioned mobile housing vouchers, folks, federal programs called Section 8 people are familiar with. So, and I also mentioned earlier subsidized mortgages. There's more than one way to meet that number, to satisfy the need for lower income households. In Connecticut, it's construction, but it's also other tools like A30G and vouchers and subsidized mortgages.
Coming up, we're going to talk more about exclusionary zoning. I understand, Sean, some towns have adopted inclusionary zoning. They are developing multifamily units. I'm wondering if you can respond to that. That's progress?
Yes, I think certain communities where there's strong demand for housing, inclusionary zoning, which tells the developer that in order to move forward with the development, they have to set aside a certain percentage of the homes as affordable. That can work, particularly in strong markets. So mostly in Connecticut, where we see inclusionary zoning ordinances in places, in Fairfield County, particularly lower Fairfield County, and they've created quite a few units. Stamford, I think, is probably the best example. They accumulate units that way, but also fees, so that they can then support their own local public housing authority and other nonprofit housing developers. So it is another tool, and there have to be many tools to expand housing opportunity in the state.
You've been hearing Sean Guillo, again, Policy Director for the Partnership for Strong Communities. Also with us, Camila Vallejo, Connecticut's Public's housing reporter. Thank you both for your time on the show.
Thank you, Lucy.
Up next,
Thank you, Lucy.
We're going to be learning after a break how zoning policies have constrained housing in our state and nationwide. There are efforts to create a national zoning atlas. We talk about the need. You can join us too, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Coming up, we learn how local zoning policies have profound consequences on the inability to have a variety of housing in communities. Yale law professor Robert Ellickson writes in his new book, America's Frozen Neighborhoods, that zoning freezes land uses in established neighborhoods and impacts the economy because real estate markets cannot respond to supply and demand. More from him in just a few minutes. Joining us now is Sarah Bronin, founder of Desegregate Connecticut, Desegregate CT, which has pushed for zoning reform in our state. Sarah is a professor at Cornell University and the director of the Legal Constructs Lab, where she's overseen the creation of a national zoning atlas that was informed by the one that Desegregate CT built for our state in recent years. Sarah, welcome back to our show.
Thanks for having me, Lucy.
Our listeners can join as well, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Sarah, when we think about the data that exists around zoning codes town to town, what did you find through Desegregate CT's work and now with this work on the National Atlas? Why it's so important to understand these policies?
Well, when we started advocating here in Connecticut through Desegregate Connecticut, people were asking us time and time again, how do our communities zone? And as Sean pointed out, we've had blue ribbon commissions, we've had CHRO reports, going back to the year I was born, 1978, and probably before that too, that have said that there is a problem, but we really haven't deployed the tools, the analytical tools that have developed since 40 something years ago to really pinpoint the issues. And so what we did was we looked at the zoning maps. We tied those maps to data about how each jurisdiction in Connecticut zones, and we found some really shocking results. We found that 91% of land in the state is zoned for single family housing, while just 2% of land in the state allows for as of right multifamily housing. As Sean and Camila pointed out, that a lot of that is concentrated in urban locations, that kind of zoning. And the other towns in Connecticut tend to have exclusionary features. One of those is just one example is the minimum lot size, which in Connecticut, 80% of residential land is a 1 acre minimum lot size, which is enormous, absolutely enormous, especially compared to many other jurisdictions across the country. So just as we've been trying to figure out how exactly Connecticut zones and really quantify that using geospatial techniques and tying careful reads of zoning codes to these maps, we're trying to do that nationally too. So we really can compare and see whether our hunch that Connecticut is even more exclusionary than other parts of the country holds true.
So when we think about the amount of work that takes to get that data, I'm wondering if you can tell us more about that National Zoning Atlas. Where do you begin, and tell us about the progress so far?
Well, you have to start somewhere. And so what we've tried to do is to slowly build up teams from across the country. We were fortunate in that there were already people who were interested in zoning data and collecting much of this data. So out at UC Berkeley, that's where our California Zoning Atlas team is housed. They were already collecting this kind of data in the larger San Francisco regions and LA and Sacramento. And so now we're working with them to expand that to the whole state. Researchers in Minnesota, same thing. We've been able to get teams from Montana, Texas, New Hampshire, Hawaii, neighboring states like Massachusetts and Rhode Island, and even a New York zoning atlas, which is and Ohio. And these are pretty daunting because these have over 1,000 jurisdictions each. Ohio has over 2,000. So states are going to go at different paces, but this is really a team effort. We've got universities, nonprofit organizations, planning entities like the Regional Plan Association, and even state agencies are involved in various atlases. And this is also, I should say, from a wide political spectrum. So in Montana, the atlas is led by the Frontier Institute, which is libertarian leaning. We have a Texas zoning atlas, and we're about to put a few more online, including Tennessee. So we're seeing this interest across the country, and really standardizing data collection about zoning is going to enable a lot of interesting research about the impacts of zoning in different regions.
And enable research, but when we think about reform, really inform policymakers, communities about how this really does constrain housing and impacts so many. We just heard about the Woodbridge suit. Litigation is one example of a step towards reform. What are some other steps, Sarah?
Well, I mean, an alternative to litigation, and actually in many cases something that goes hand in hand in litigation is legal reform. So either through state statutes, the state enabling acts that every state has, or through local zoning ordinances. And I really believe that as people understand how we zone, I think people are much more compelled to change it. And we saw that with our Desegregate Connecticut effort, which is falls more on the statutory and ordinance reform side of things. The Zoning Atlas was used to produce a series of reports that are on the Desegregate website that showed that zoning around train stations all up and down the state, our 62 train and Connecticut fast track stations, was kind of backwards. Instead of zoning for multifamily housing around those stations, concentrating walkable communities that people really want to live in. We've zoned for large lot single family housing around train stations. So the states and federal government's investment in this kind of transit infrastructure, isn't gone entirely to waste, but we could do a lot better, get a lot more out of that investment if we arrange the land uses around those stations to match. And so the data is helping to make a case for transit-oriented communities, which I hope will make it back on the legislative session's agenda now that we don't have a short session like we did last year. And it's also making the case for a careful review of minimum lot size reform and minimum parking requirements. All of these topics have been on the table in other states, and hopefully in Connecticut, this data will help to justify changes there too.
You're hearing Sarah Bronin here where we live, a professor at Cornell University, director of the Legal Constructs Lab, where she's overseen the creation of a national zoning atlas. And we've heard about her work as well with Desegregate CT. We've mentioned the Woodbridge suit. Calling in is Jay from Branford, who is part of Open Communities Alliance. Jay, what did you want to share?
Oh, thank you. I am the board co-chair with Connie Royster, Constance Baker Motley's niece of Open Communities Alliance. You heard from Aaron Boggs, our executive director, at the top of the show. And I also, with Anika Singh-Lamar, co-direct the housing clinic at Yale Law School. And our students, on behalf of the Open Communities Alliance, initiated the zone change application in Woodbridge over 2 years ago and had the public hearings you referenced. And on August 30th, together with Wilmer Hale, a national law firm acting as pro bono counsel, and some others, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights brought suit in state court against Woodbridge, challenging their exclusionary zoning policies. And I appreciate the chance to explain that slightly more. The theory of the case, the main claim is, as you said, that Woodbridge has violated the Zoning Enabling Act. Under Connecticut state law, and as Bob Ellickson soon will explain, under most state laws, zoning is a state power. And the state delegates it to towns so that they can have authority over their own geography with respect to land use and the choices of what kind of housing and communities they want to have. But that delegation of state power is given to the towns on terms and on conditions. The towns are not given carte blanche to zone however they want to serve only their own narrow, selfish interests. In fact, state law has been changed so that the towns are required to zone on behalf of the region in which the town has lived and not just the town itself. And they're required under state law to promote affordable housing and to promote housing that serves a wide range of income spectrums.
And Jay, thank you. Thank you for that clarification. I don't want to run out of time to speak with Sarah.
I won't go much longer.
Yeah.
I won't go much
All right,
longer.
real quick, Jay.
Woodbridge has not done that. Woodbridge has zoned for itself. It's built a wall around itself, keeping out affordable housing, keeping out people of color. Sarah Bronin pointed out that only 2% of the state land has most of the affordable multifamily, multi-unit buildings in the state. And that 2% is highly segregated and in poor neighborhoods.
And thank you, Jay, again for your comments on the show. Sarah Bronin, did you want to add to what Jay clarified?
No, I think he added some important context, and looking at Woodbridge and looking at many of the communities surrounding New Haven, surrounding Hartford, they do. You can see clearly on our map. You can just click from one to the other, and it kind of reinforces this this point about the longstanding zoning that really shuts out lots of different types of options, and in fact that prevents even people who currently live in those communities from staying in those communities as they age. Different kinds of housing options, their children can't live there because they don't really have a diversity of housing choices. So it's there's a lot of consequences of zoning, and just if you looked at the benefits to people living in those communities currently, there's a strong case for rethinking all of that. So thank you.
And to put a finer point on this, again, as we're talking about the housing crisis in our state, how zoning impacts the types of housing to serve all of our residents. Joining us now on Zoom is Robert Ellickson. Again, his new book is America's Frozen Neighborhoods, The Abuse of Zoning. It examines local zoning policies and suggests reforms that states and the federal government might adopt to counter the negative effects of exclusionary zoning. Robert is the Walter E. Meyer Professor Emeritus of Property and Urban Law at Yale Law School. Welcome to our show.
Thank you.
Now, your new book draws on an article, The Zoning Straitjacket, where you looked at Silicon Valley, the greater New Haven area, as well as the greater Austin area. I'm wondering if you can talk about the zoning restrictions or the freedom in some places to develop housing that appeals to a wide range of incomes.
I chose the three metropolitan areas that I ended up picking to contrast their various policies. In Austin, for example, in Greater Austin, it has been much easier to build multifamily housing than in the Silicon Valley and in Greater New Haven. New Haven is famous for its exclusionary zoning. I'll mention some statistics from Woodbridge, Connecticut. Woodbridge zones 98% of its land for a minimum of 1.5 acres, a minimum lot size, and restricts that land to single family unit development and so forth. And this is, needless to say, greatly constrained what builders have been able to do. I should pay tribute to Sarah's work because she and I are both interested in finding out more about how zoning actually works. And her Connecticut Atlas is an impressive document, and now she's going national with it. I should explain a little bit about my finding that America's neighborhoods are frozen. What I mean by that is that there's an enormous status quo bias in local zoning politics, where give the example of Palo Alto, California, which is at the heart of the Silicon Valley. Basically, Palo Alto has frozen its zones. It's been zoning for over 100 years. And it almost never changes 99% of the time. It has not changed the zones that it uses in single family neighborhoods. Unlike Connecticut suburbs, New Haven suburbs, Palo Alto's requirements for minimum lot sizes are fairly generous in that they're often 6,000 or 8,000 square feet, which is relatively small, very different than Woodbridge, for example. They never change. They almost never zone an existing single family neighborhood to multifamily housing. Let me turn now to Woodbridge, Connecticut. 98% of the land in Woodbridge is zoned for a minimum lot size of 1.5 acres. Much of it, by the way, 2 acres. And Woodbridge started down this path in the 1930s. So it's the granddaddy, if you will, of exclusionary zoning in Greater New Haven. Some mention has been made of Connecticut Statute 830G. I'm actually critical in my book of that approach. The best way to help housing consumers, I think, is to use vouchers. And there's Sean has mentioned Section 8 of vouchers that is a federal program. And that's vastly better in most circumstances to building projects. Projects lock in various people. The worst was, of course, public housing, but the low-income housing tax credit also locks in people.
We mentioned the greater Austin area. And so when we think about Silicon Valley, Bob, where it's 10 times the median house value nationwide, how people are moving into the Austin area. And why is that when it comes to zoning there and the availability of different housing?
Austin has traditionally been, whether it will continue to be, is not clear, but has continued to be much more pro-housing than Silicon Valley, to use an example, and certainly Connecticut as one of the worst exclusionary zoning states. So at any rate, let me just say a word about home rule. The advocates of local control over zoning often state that, correctly, I think, that local people have better knowledge on average than state people do, for example, about local conditions. And that I think is true. On the other hand, the problem is that with home rule, and which is an exalted principle in Connecticut, there's no incentive for people to take into account the effects of their policies on the availability of housing for regional housing consumers. So this means that home rule, I think, is, in my book, forthcoming book, attacks home rule as in principle on the ground that there's too much of it in the United States. This is the home rule, by the way, is a legal concept, but is most jurisdictions have honor to some extent home rule. So I'm anyway. My book is controversial in the sense that I am attacking this sacred cow in Connecticut of local autonomy, but I think that's been a misguided principle in the United States.
In your book, we learn how zoning can strangle housing production. It restricts greater residential density. You also write, not all zoning is bad, but the bad zoning are rules that flunk benefit cost analysis. Can you explain that?
My general approach is to use benefit cost analysis, and that's my normative position in assessing policies. And so the thought is that local zoning policies commonly inflict more damage on outsiders, regional housing consumers, than they benefit insiders. And at worst, zoning operates to serve the interests of what I call at times homeowner cartels, where they deliberately increase the cost of housing. The cartel increases the cost of housing by restricting its restricting its production, housing production. So those are my main themes.
You're hearing Robert Ellickson here where we live, again, author of this new book, America's Frozen Neighborhoods, The Abuse of Zoning. His book examines local zoning policies and suggests reforms to counter exclusionary zoning. We're going to hear more right after a short break, and we'll also continue talking with Sarah Bronin, Cornell University professor and director of the Legal Constructs Lab, where she's overseen the creation of a national zoning atlas, informed by the one she helped build for Connecticut. You can join us too. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today we're talking to two researchers about zoning reform that could help address a housing crisis in our state and across the country. With us, Sarah Bronin, a Cornell University professor. She's overseen the creation of a national zoning atlas informed by the one she built for Connecticut. Also with us, Robert Ellickson, who is the author of the new book. He's a Yale Law School professor. The book is titled America's Frozen Neighborhoods, The Abuse of Zoning. Sarah, we got a comment from a listener who shared that the coordination between zoning reform and the climate crisis, this relationship between these two movements will be one made in heaven. And she wanted to know, is there any movement to coordinate them together?
Absolutely. So here in Connecticut, we were really thrilled to engage many members of the environmental community through Desegregate Connecticut. We had on our coalition Save the Sound, the Trust for Public Land, Cleaner Connecticut Coalition, and other groups that really focus on issues of the environment. And the reason is that good housing policies that help to provide opportunities for people to live in arrangements beyond large lot, single family zoning only, actually are really good for the environment. So thinking back to that comment I made about zoning around our train stations, the logical thing to do for climate is to put housing and mixes of uses around those stations so that people can walk and get from one place to another. It also helps to build transit ridership, which is essential for us to fix many issues in our state. And actually, we're proud too to have Transport Hartford and other people-friendly Stanford and other groups to focus on these topics in the Desegregate Connecticut Coalition as well. I should add Clean Water Action, the Citizens Climate Lobbies, Sierra Club, Connecticut. So there's a lot of groups on our coalition that are interested in these issues. But beyond just this, I guess you could call it the smart growth aspect of rethinking our zoning and pushing for more density in smart places, is just the general efficiency aspect, which is that when you build large lot zoning, you're pushing people further and further outward, which means that you're building more roads, you're creating more infrastructure that's very costly to local and state governments. And at the same time, it's destroying farmland and forest. One of the shows I was on last year, actually on Where We Live, was about agricultural zoning and how our zoning is really hurting our farmers and our ability to produce food and be self-sufficient. All of these issues are tied together. So I really applaud the listener who made those connections, because they're really important. And I think nationally, we will see more environmental groups involved in zoning reform as more data is produced that shows the links between zoning, driving, greenhouse gas emissions, wasteful infrastructure, and degradation of our forests, farmlands, wetlands, and other environmentally sensitive areas. So join the housing movement. The housing movement is an environmental movement.
Thank you, Sarah, for that. Again, with us, Robert Ellickson, who's written the new book, America's Frozen Neighborhoods, The Abuse of Zoning. We just have about 5 minutes left, Bob, and you also touch in your book that this is more than just dealing with this from a federal standpoint. The quote here from you: members of the mass media tend to regard anything that happens at City Hall as unworthy of attention. So again, drilling down to local zoning ordinances and the greater impact, one of the suggestions in your book, state legislatures also are the key to zoning reform. Can you explain?
Yes, I firmly believe this, that the state is the right level, not the federal government, to correct the abuse of zoning. Local governments have misbehaved. They have used their home rule powers and so forth to damage regional housing consumers. But there's no reason to federalize these issues. In my view, the states are the ideal correctors of these kinds of policies. The Connecticut legislature, for example, has ample power to constrain local zoning practices by, for example, limiting the number, the large lot various exclusionary practices that local governments otherwise would undertake. So I think the states are the key.
You also suggest, that states could establish an agency dedicated to the goal of reducing local barriers to the construction of least cost housing. Have you seen
Yes.
Other models in other states where that proves true, that type of solution is working for particular communities?
There are very few communities, states that actually have such programs. But I do, in my book, advocate federal grants in aid to federal agencies, federal grants in aid to state agencies that would take on that particular task.
You also promised to share all of the data you've compiled with other researchers. And so when we think about the momentum here, Bob, are you optimistic?
Moderately optimistic, I would say, with Sarah and others who've done marvelous work and so forth. There is a bit of momentum for zoning reform, but I'm not incredibly optimistic about it. I think the status quo bias that pervades zoning politics is quite profound, and I'm not sure that reformers will overcome it.
Again, you've been hearing Robert Ellickson, the Walter E. Meyer Professor Emeritus of Property and Urban Law at Yale Law School, author of this new book, America's Frozen Neighborhoods, The Abuse of Zoning. Thank you so much, Bob, for your time on the show.
Okay, clear.
And also Sarah Bronin, a professor of Cornell University, director of the Legal Constructs Lab, where she's overseeing the creation of a national zoning atlas. Definitely worth the time to revisit Sarah in the future. Thank you for your perspective.
Thank you so much. And I'll just say I'm very optimistic. So keep up the fight out there.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today's show produced by Katie Pellico. Special thanks to Gina Matruda and Dylan Reyes. We'll be back tomorrow with a Mac Found recipient, a Mac Arthur Genius grant, Dr. Emily Wong. We'll be hearing from her from the Yale School of Medicine. We hope you join us for that conversation.